Thank you very much. I appreciate it, Kat. Thank you very much for Expert Agile Club for inviting me to speak. I was very excited. And we do have an awful lot of ground to cover tonight, so without any further ado, let's get right to our presentation. And you verify. This is our new branded presentation. I kid you not, this is it. I was a little surprised too. It's definitely cheery, but this is a talk that I've given a number of times over the past few years called Finding the Seams, and it's focusing on making user stories smaller. We're going to talk about a lot of things before we talk about how to actually make them smaller, so let's just get right into it. It's my belief, in my experience, that the way that we transmit information the best is by story. And that's because storytelling is something that's very, very deep in our collective consciousness. Hang on a second, I gotta figure out how to, there we go. So I ordinarily don't read slides, but I will, and you'll see in my slides I'll often highlight things in color. And these are the things that I'm kind of targeting with this big paragraph. But when we look back through history, stories have always played an important part in our lives. Telling stories was the way to pass information across generations to make sure that history and facts were not lost. It was also a way for us to make sense of the world around us, to find a way to explain what we did not understand, the things we feared and that which we desired.
Hi, Mitch. I'm so sorry to cut you off. Apparently, there's static coming from your end. Just wanted to let you know.
Static. All right, I'm going to.
Sometimes that can happen with mics.
Okay, I will ditch the headphones.
Thank you so much. And
How's
so
that?
sorry.
Does that sound okay? Is that better?
No, there's still the static.
Ooh, well, there's. I'm not sure what I can do about it. Let me see if I can adjust my mic. Is that any better?
It's better. The static is gone. Thank you.
All right. Sorry about that, folks. There's more of us wrestling with technology. Please forgive me. So let's continue. Storytelling in various forms and shapes helped us make what we were going through more tangible. Through telling stories, we were able to give each other a glimpse into what happened and share that which we believed to be the truth about the world we lived in. It was both a way to educate and entertain, but also a way to pass it on and instill moral values. So we talk about storytelling in this context because of its importance in relation to describing value in an agile product management organization. And this is actually from a great book by Anna Dahlstrom, Storytelling in Design, Principles and Tools for Defining, Designing, and Selling Multi-Device Design Products. It's a very general work, but it has a lot of applicability because of the structure of stories. So why do we even talk in the language of stories? The term user story was originated with the XP, Extreme Programming Revolution in the 90s. It was used as a metaphor for a conversation, and it's meant to be a thing that has a beginning, a middle, and an end, much like a fairy tale. Frequently, we will have epilogues with our stories, which you can think of as kind of retrospectives to our story. In our world, the storytellers are product owners and other people who are involved with product management teams. We can say that when we start a fairy tale, we sometimes start with once upon a time. And in a similar way, when we write stories, we talk about as a role, as a user of some value, I need something. And that's the way we mark a user story. And the roles of those stories are the characters in the stories that we write and tell. When we talk about the meaning of the story, the value proposition, that represents the plot and action of the story. And when we get to happily ever after, that's when we've met our definition of done. So it just begs the question. If we want to talk about making stories smaller, we have to talk about how big stories should be. If stories are too short, frequently they give a sense of incompleteness, and they will trigger a sense that we don't know enough of information about the subject matter to make an accurate story about it. When stories are too long and too detailed, we get the opposite sense. We get the sense that we've underestimated, that it's more complex than we think it is. So how long should a story be? A story should be just about as long as a decent joke. And I love comedians. I followed comedians my whole life, and I love listening to and telling jokes. And I can tell you, everybody knows there are jokes that are too long, there are jokes that are too short, and there are jokes that are just right. And jokes also have a beginning, a middle, and an end. And we end up with this rule, which I call the Goldilocks Rule, that gives us a sense about how big stories should be. Mike Cohen, Agile signatory, like Goldilocks in search of a comfortable bed, some stories can be too big, some can be too small, and some can be just right. Story size does matter, because if stories are too large or too small, you cannot use them in planning. Epics, or big stories, are difficult to work with because they frequently contain multiple stories. For example, in a travel reservation system, a user can plan a vacation is an epic. Planning a vacation is important functionality for a travel reservation system, but there are many tasks involved in doing so. The epic should be split into smaller stories. The ultimate determination of whether a story is appropriately sized is based on the team, its capabilities, and the technologies in use. And this implies that there's no rule of thumb about how big stories should be, about how many words they have. We have to figure out for ourselves in each subjective case what's just right. And what we're going to do and talk about how we think of estimation in relation to story size, we're going to go through a thought experiment. So I can't see you guys, and I guess you can see me. But what I'd like you to do is focus carefully. I'm going to read 7 words to you. And the only thing you have to do for this exercise is just picture in your head the object that I'm going to mention. I'm going to mention 7 words, and all I ask is close your eyes so you don't see the screen. Close your eyes, and I'm going to read the 7 words, and then try to remember the picture that comes into your mind when you hear these words. Okay. Mountain, boulder, slab, stone, pebble, gravel, sand. Okay, you can open your eyes. Those are the 7 words right there: mountain, boulder, slab, stone, pebble, gravel, sand. As you'll notice, this is kind of its own sort of Fibonacci sequence, we can even say. Mountains, boulders, slab, stone, pebble, all these things are made of the same substance, relatively speaking. They have approximately the same density, they have similar atomic structure, but each has a different relative mass and can be construed for different purposes. And so the reason why we have to talk about appropriate size is because we can't use boulders or mountains to build things with. We have to have things that are workable. Whatever it is, if we try to build something with elements that are too big, it will be a very, very long-term project and require a lot more in the way of resources and coordination. And you will notice, if you've ever been on or known about or heard about high-performing teams, you will see the high-performing teams do not build things out of boulders and slabs. They build things out of stones, the appropriate size thing to build a house. My house is partly made of stone. When we use smaller material, but not too small, because we can't build out of sand either, we have a different problem. When we use smaller material than boulders, it means that we can build faster and deliver value cheaper. That's why we need to right-size our stories, just like we have to right-size the materials that we use to build a house or building. And then along comes Don Reinertsen. If you've heard of Don Reinertsen, he is basically the father of what I would call modern product or program management. Don Reinertsen literally wrote the book. It's one of the books that's used very much in the SAFe methodology to talk about Q theory. And he basically connected Q theory with product management behavior. And his main conclusion is that the work that we try to attempt to do is too big, we will have trouble handling it. So by reducing the batch size, by reducing the size of the piece of work that we're doing, we end up with reduced cycle time as per Little's law. And Little's law is this equation right here. I mean, it's called Little's law because it's a law, but it's just a fraction. And basically, it's the wait time is the average wait time divided by the number of people. So the idea is to reduce the average wait time. And we have, with smaller batch sizes, we have reduced variability of flow. We have reduced risk, reduced overhead, accelerated feedback. And that's what gives us efficiency and value flow. If our work is big, it takes us a long time to get feedback about our work. If our work is small, if we deliver it in small, meaningful, deliverable increments of value, then our efficiency will tend to increase. So that's our rationale for making things small. Another thing that's wrong with big batches, how many of you have seen a Kanban board that looks like this? All right, so this is the opposite, right? When we have larger batch sizes, it's much harder to estimate. It's harder to estimate large things than it is small things. Or you end up with work in progress nightmares like this one, where our large batch sizes mean that it just takes forever for things to move across the Kanban. Big work means more test cases per story, more variation on the functionality in the unit of work means more testing. Also, bigger work means longer duration. Longer duration means bigger cost. You will notice if you've ever planned that it's easier to plan and adjust plans when the things that we're adjusting are smaller rather than they're bigger. And big batches, we have lower motivation and urgency for completion because of those really super long feedback cycles. And this is why this is outside the scope of this talk. When people talk about WIP limits, this is to prevent this situation from happening where we have things piling up in progress and not getting out. Work that does not get out to the customer is dead weight. It's what we call inventory waste in a software sense. The work that's in progress has no value. It only has value when it's in that done column and it's being consumed. Jerry Kilpatrick wrote in Lean Principles that reducing batch sizes reduces the amount of work in process inventory. Not only does this reduce inventory carrying costs, but also production lead time, or cycle time, is approximately directly proportional to the amount of WIP. In other words, the quickness that your organization can move, the agility of your organization is directly proportional to the amount of work that is being done at any one time. The number of things that you were doing at once, the number of balls that you are trying to juggle gets progressively more difficult. It's very difficult to juggle 3 balls. I can't do it. It's almost impossible to juggle 4, and I can't even imagine juggling 5. So we like to try to always keep our work in process down to a reasonable number. Smaller batch sizes shorten the overall production cycle, enabling companies to deliver more quickly and to invoice sooner for improved cash flow. Shorter production cycles increases inventory turns and allows the company to operate profitably at lower margins, which enables price reductions, which increases sales and market share. So now we have our rationale for why we want our work to be small. Perhaps if you've been involved with product management for any length of time, you're familiar with this mnemonic invented by Bill Wake, the INVEST mnemonic. And INVEST is a kind of a intellectual test for the soundness of user stories. And user stories should be all these 6 things. And we can decide in large part whether a story is ready to be engaged if it fulfills these 6 requirements. And going into all of these is beyond the scope of this talk, but I'm going to talk about 2 of them. And the two that I'm going to talk about are estimable or estimatable and small. User stories must be estimatable or estimable, and they must be small. And now we'll talk about why that is. If you can't estimate it, you can't build it. Plain and simple. If you can't understand something enough to know approximately how long it will take to make it real, then you don't truly understand it. And estimates are developed iteratively, not definitive. We don't have one issue. Hang on a second. Sorry about that. Estimates, we develop them iteratively. We don't sit down and then say, this is the estimate. We work on estimates. They are developed as the information about them develop. As we learn more about a story, we refine it, and we refine it, and we refine it. And the reason we do that is because we want to make these decisions at the last responsible moment, and we accept that we are never going to know everything that we need to know about a story. Also, once we start learning about a story until we stop learning about a story, context and situations change. Sometimes customer relationships change. Sometimes team structures change. That's why we say estimates are never permanent. The only time that they're absolutely permanent is after the story is done. After the story is done, we never update that estimate. As a matter of fact, it's kind of interesting to look back and see how well teams estimates. But I will say this, estimates are not intended to be perfect. And over time, the error in estimation washes out. And we have found this to be true over and over again. And the accuracy of estimation should never be a performance metric. And I say this most urgently. I just had a case of this with a colleague of mine. And he said that he had heard from, we're in the Agile world, the coaching world is kind of smallish. And I heard about this company that was going to be evaluating for like HR purposes based on accuracy of estimation is a proficiency tick for your like annual review. And that was very, very upsetting to this person, and I don't blame them. The accuracy of estimation should never be a performance metric. If you're bad at estimation, the only thing you can do is get better. You can't punish people for not estimating well. It's not easy to do. We call that estimation angst. And it's actually a very common pattern in teams that are not quite mature. When we have Agile teams that are really, really mature, that are really high performing, they don't need to estimate because they already know to break down work small enough to where everything is a one-point story, and we don't have to worry about estimating. And I'm not going to go into a tangent about the no estimates movement, but it's something that I would encourage you to investigate if that's something that interests you. One of the reasons that it's a great movement is to avoid this anti-pattern of estimation angst. It's rooted in what we fear of failure, fear of being wrong, fear of being perceived as technically weak. Sometimes we are culturally pushed to achieve more than is actually realistic. Also, we always have concerns about unpredictability. We're hesitant to give estimation because we don't understand something completely. And it can actually go all the way through to kind of severe issues, severe toxicity, and become more about anxiety about maybe losing your job or your position because of estimation. We should never be putting ourselves in that position. I can tell you this, that breaking your work down small makes things easier to estimate. Smaller estimates are less intimidating and less prone to error. They cause fewer problems going through the system. Big things cause big problems, small things, small problems. User stories have to be estimable and small. And I can tell you from having done this for a while that this is a very difficult battle that I fight as a coach, which is the tendency to make stories bigger than they can be in order to be done. So big stories are hard to understand, bigger things are hard to estimate, and they're hard to bring across the finish line. And we know that we can't really solve a complex problem intrinsically, that anytime we have a complex problem, It has to be broken down to a simpler problem. And then by virtue of solving simpler problems, we then solve complex problems that way. So we know we have to break down complex problems. So we don't try to attack complex user stories. We focus instead on getting them to be small. If you're familiar with the typical baseline estimation that is recommended by SAFE, for example, where we use a Fibonacci scale, larger stories or stories that come in as 5+, they seem to always cause issues when they appear on a sprint plan. And that's because if you're using the pure estimation scheme that's recommended by SAFE, a 5-point story segment takes more than half a sprint to complete. And if that's the case, then the likelihood of you completing that is very, very low if you don't get that story done in the first couple days of a sprint. That's why I recommend, if we use that scheme, we keep actionable stories to ideally 1, 2, 3 if we need to, 4 if we have 2 points when possible. We want to try and get the stories down as small as possible. And the way we do that is by using iterative elaboration. And that allows us to split these stories down and make it more efficient to consume. So let's talk about splitting stories. So how do we split stories? Why we already went through this. They move across the Kanban, easier to test, easier to demo, faster time to QA. We want to minimize the time that QA assets are idle. We want to have testing starting as early in a sprint as possible. And we already talked about, as things change, that shorter stories mean more flexibility when the conditions might change. And if we're planning on an iterative basis, if we're using Scrum or Scrumban, or if we're on a SAFE team and we're working in development iterations, smaller things are easier to organize in an iteration. And there are things like epics and features, that's outside the scope of this talk, but there are things that do have a longer lifespan than a user story, but they have a different rationale and different techniques for splitting. And that's a little out of scope for this talk, but I love to talk about features too. We're just not talking about features today. So what I am advising, and this is I say it's an incomplete list, but I'm going to read these words to you, and I would like you all to kind of think, what makes these words similar? What's interesting about these words? And, both, multiple, different, or, also, many, with, then, various, next, when, separate, similar, like, unlike. All of these words, which I call seam words, these are all words that if you see these words in a user story, there's a good chance that that user story can be split. For example, if I say something like or unlike, that implies that there's two things that I'm comparing. If so, that's an opportunity to split that story on a seam. Or if I talk about mixed, identical, alike, these are all comparative things. Certain is identification. After, before, it might be workflow or some other type of timing. It all implies multiplicity. And that's what we're looking for inside our stories. We're looking for multiplicity that we can take advantage of. And the seam words are the easy way to do that. So let's look at a couple real quick stories here. Oh, here we go. Seam words are a dead giveaway that a story can or needs to be split, and they imply that there's actually multiple value statements within a single one. So we look for the seams and we split on the seams into more achievable stories. We use an iterative elaboration, which we'll go through to do that. And it also works, although a little differently, for bigger value, like features, capabilities, epics, and et cetera. But here's how the seam words basically work. So I could see here's just 8 quickie stories. They're not meant to be meaningful. They're just meant to be an example. And kind of scan through these with your eyes. And I'll just give you just 30 seconds to read through these. Scan with your eyes and see if you can pick out the seam words in these 8 little mini stories here. I'll give you a clue. In the first one, as an admin, I want to change passwords for internal and external users. Well, the and is the obvious seam word. I can deliver value to my internal users, and then deliver value to my external users. And I can split that story into 2 stories. So how would we do that for the rest of these stories? I'll just give a couple moments. Take a look then. Okay. And of course we have the answers, okay? And these are the seam words that we're looking for. So if I could say, for example, if I could say as a manager, I can export various reports. Well, various implies multiplicity. I need to figure out what reports and see what I can deliver. What's the least I can deliver? What's my minimal marketable feature? What's my minimum deliverable value? Or same thing here. As a sales user, I can sort results by different sales regions or demographics. Well, if it's different, that means that I can split this into multiple value statements depending on how many sales regions or demographics that I'm looking at. That's when I would start to have these conversations that we're going to talk about of iterative elaboration. As an auditor, I can review the accounts for many kinds of users. Well, that's great, but what kinds of users? Which is the most important kind of user to review activity for? These are questions that we answer in this iterative elaboration. Same thing with the next area, certain sales regions. Well, what do we mean by certain? That's a conversation we have with our product manager and product owners. As a manager, I can show identical views. Well, identical, that implies that there's a comparison. If there's a comparison, there's multiplicity. Right, so how can I restate that in a number? And the same thing with the last few stories. I can take these and I can break them down almost trivially by using these seam words. It's the easiest way to break stories down that there is. We're not going to get into some of the more complex breakdowns that are technical breakdowns, such as modularization. That's a different topic for a different audience. So what do we end up? What are the products of story? What do we do with story splitting? We use spikes. And if everybody should be familiar with spikes, if not, I'll explain them. A spike is a plannable increment of time, a time box that we allocate within a planning horizon, whatever it may be, to understand and split complex, lengthy, or other stories that have this natural multiplicity, that have these seams. We use spikes to take time to make our big stories small. Sometimes we will split a story into a bunch of little stories. Sometimes we will split a story in such a way where we actually change part of the story to an acceptance criterion. Sometimes we'll split a story and part of it will come out of scope. And there's a couple other ways that we can split, but we don't have enough time to talk about that, which is to split by testing requirements. And I'll briefly mention that what that means is if there are certain features that you need to test more or less rigorously, sometimes we will split those stories because the testing becomes a constraint on the delivery of that value. But that's out of scope for this talk. And then we also have modularization, and that's a technical way of splitting. These are more along the lines of architectural or development or design than actual product management and user story maintenance. So here's one way we can split something. So I may have something that is that we know is bigger, and we're going to call that a feature. If you're a Jira user, they call them epics. But I will say a feature is something that is bigger than a story. You can think of it as a bucket of stories, as a bucket of related stories. The stories represent the work of the feature broken down. When the stories are complete, the feature is complete. And when I get a feature like, as an auditor, I can review the accounts of many kinds of users. Well, my best practice is to have a spike, set some time aside so that you can sit down with subject matter experts and figure out, when we say many kinds, well, how many kinds of users are there? And what's the most common? What's needed for minimal delivery, which we could say MVP or MMF. MVP, minimal viable product, MMF, minimal marketable function. They both kind of mean the same thing, the least amount of functionality that satisfies a customer need. And if I go through this spike, then what I'll end up with is 3 stories. I'll start off delivering the ability to do the most common type of user, or the most important type of user, and then the second most, and the third most, et cetera. But I need that spike time to dig in a little further and break that feature down into work that's small enough to be done in an increment. And that's what we mean by a user story, small enough to be done in an increment. Usually when we say increment, we really mean sprint. So it's something that can be done in somewhere between 1 and 3 weeks, a small increment of work that a customer can take advantage of. That's delivered value. So that's one way of splitting the story, which is splitting a big thing down into smaller things. And we use the same logic here. We see many kinds. That's our clue. Our clue of the multiplicity is that we say many kinds of users. Sometimes we split things out and we end up with a criterion. But we sometimes have to have a spike here to figure out why it's a criterion. So here's a little mini story. As a manager, I can show identical views for similar employee types. And that's kind of wide open. So I also have a spike here. I allocate some time with my team. I group up with the people who are the best people that I can think of to answer the questions. And I ask, how many employee types are there? You know, it's a different landscape altogether. Let's say I just have 2 employee types, full-time and part-time. Okay, well, that makes it a simpler problem. If I have 11 types of employees, then it's a more complicated problem. If I have 111, even more complicated. But that's why we have that spike, to figure out what's going on, to put some meat on the bones of this story and make it legitimate. And the way we make it legitimate is by figuring out these 3 things. How many employees are there? How many different ways can we view them? And how do we know they're identical? If we can answer those 3 questions, then we can build a real story. And this is an example of a story with a criterion. As a manager, I want to have consistent views for the most common employee types so that I can interpret them consistently and compare them accurately. And then I have a little given when then, which is the cucumber or gherkin notation for an acceptance criterion. Given manager access when the salaried and employee views are compared, then the views will be identical content and style upon visual or automated inspection. And so we've actually split this story not into multiple stories, but we split out the information in the narrative of the story where it's not the best place for it, but into the criteria of the story, which is where this type of information really belongs, in the criteria of the story. Here's my favorite. Sometimes if we have the right conversations, we can crack pieces off and we can bust them out of scope. So for example, for the last example, I'm going to have my little spike and I'm going to huddle with my peeps and I'm going to get however many subject matter experts I can to give me the definitive answers that I need. And I'm going to have a conversation with my product owner. I'm going to say, hey, product owner, do we really need to do every type of employee? And then the product owner's job is to constrain that and say, no, we only need it for these types, or we need it for this type first, or the most important type. And then the other stuff now becomes out of scope. So that's an ideal situation where we take something that looked like a big piece of work, and it turns out that if we look at it the right way and ask the right questions, it actually becomes a much smaller piece of work. And these are the types of conversations that we generally have when we engage in this iterative elaboration on backlog items. Let's talk a little bit about iterative elaboration and refinement. Now, user stories are written, and everybody here, at least I would have to assume everybody here has gone to school at least once, and they've had to write a composition at least once. And we were taught how to write compositions, and it's actually a pretty smart way of doing it. And we basically do it the same way that we write user stories. We want to sit down and say I was going to write my autobiography. Well, you know, I need to write down, I'm going to start off and say, well, what are the major interesting things in my life, and make a list, and that's going to be my outline. I may even start off with something really simple and just say Mitch's life. And then I elaborate that with an outline. You know, Mitch, the early years, Mitch the forgotten years, aka the college years, Mitch the Wall Street years, all those things would then be my first level outline. And then I'm going to successfully add more material to the outline until I've conveyed the information that I need. When I write user stories, we're going to do it the same way. User stories start out in kind of a larval stage. They start out, maybe it's a simple verb noun or noun verb, or maybe it's just the name, the very, very basic name of a functionality. And then we start to elaborate that into a real story by adding more information into the narrative, by adding material that turns into acceptance criteria, also by iteratively updating estimates, risks, and dependencies. And risks and dependencies are oft forgotten parts of user stories that we need to assess. And then we repeat this process until the definition of ready is achieved. And that's a whole other talk unto itself as well, but just in case you're not familiarity with it, we say the definition of ready is part of a team agreement between the product owner and the team, or among the team, we could say, as to what constitutes when a story is ready to be engaged by the team. And the simplest version of that is the invest mnemonic that we looked at a few moments ago. And that the story has the minimal requirements to be engaged by the team. It needs to be, for example, at 75 to 85% completeness. It needs to be estimated. It needs to be risk evaluated. Dependencies need to be evaluated. All these things are baked into a definition of ready. Definition of ready is a living agreement between the members of the team with each other, and the product owner being in a Scrum team, just one of the members of the team. And the definition of ready is agreed upon by the team. It should not really be imposed. Agile teams are supposed to be self-managing, self-organizing, autonomous. So we don't want to impose a definition of ready on a team. We want them to agree to when they feel a user story meets the criteria to be engaged as a work in progress. So just a little bit more on iterative elaboration. Once again, we start off with very general ideas, and then we iterate to increase the specificity. We don't lock ourselves up someplace and say, okay, we're just going to work on this story and we're not leaving until we're done. The best way to do that is to start off with small stories. I call that in that larval state. They may be incomplete, have an incomplete narrative and incomplete acceptance criteria. And then we elaborate iteratively. And the stories, every time we iterate over a story, it becomes more real, it becomes more tangible, it becomes more doable, it becomes more estimable. And the understanding of risks and dependencies, which are just as important as the other parts of the story, becomes clear. And we have to remember, user stories don't start as ready. They start as a very tiny particle of an idea, and it takes iterative elaboration to get to the point where they're ready to be engaged by the team. And we use the 3 C's technique. This is also in a number of different methodologies. The 3 C's are card, conversation, and confirmation. And I find it especially amusing given our current situation of pandemic, where back in the good old days when we would all get together and huddle somewhere in a conference room with a few stacks of sticky notes. I still have mine with me. Always handy, Sharpie, always handy. And we would do this on a board. And we would put these cards up, and we would put whatever information we knew on the card and document it. And that becomes our larval, our nascent story. And then we engage in conversation to try and elaborate the details, most of the details of how we know the value has been delivered. So in this case, if I want to give the ability for users to unlock their accounts, I need to know and have a conversation about how the users will make that request. And a product owner or an architect will tell me, look, there's going to be a special email account they'll use so that they can reset their passwords. And then that confirmation gets baked into the story as an acceptance criterion, in this case using Gherkin format. And this is really a never-ending cycle. The elaboration over the backlog is meant to be continuous. It's not something that you do once a week for an hour. It's something that you have to bake into your time of work as a product owner, a product manager, a member of a product management team to get stories ready to be engaged. This process has to happen, and you can't do it all at once. And you can do it in the safe context of PI planning, which is when you are generally expected to get your stories ready for planning. Of course, as teams, if you know what features you're going to be getting, you can also, as teams, allocate time to get yourself ready and have these larval stories ready to go so that by the time you're PI planning, you're a step ahead. However, that's only the case if you know what features you're getting before you engage them. Otherwise, you have to wait and see. So we start the 3 C's iteratively. We start out with a simple idea, like it might be reset password. Okay, that's just a noun and a verb, nothing special. But I need to elaborate. Well, what does that mean, reset password? So I read that out loud to the team. There's an impression that some people have, I think it's a misunderstanding, that entire teams must partake in all story elaboration always. That's not how I coach. I coach that it's the product owner's responsibility, or amongst their responsibilities, to find out who the right people are to talk about each story. And that we don't need to have agreement asset from the whole team in order to move a story forward. That turns into a very wasteful practice, and it can be taken to ridiculous extreme. But when we say the team, we mean the little t team, whoever's working on the story. We add a little bit of information each time. There's nothing worse than convening 15 people on a meeting and having everybody watch one person type something into Jira. That is not iterative elaboration. I don't know what it is, but that's not it. That's something, iterative elaboration is a ongoing conversation between all the members of the team that are going to be involved with delivering that value. We set time boxes and we allocate time, place, and space to define and refine. You must make time with your teams to do this and take as much advantage of the spike, which is allocating time to do this research about stories as you can. And my kind of byline in this is iteration is better than rumination. In other words, you're better off if you can't agree about something, walk away from it, talk about something else for a while, come back to it. It's better to do that than get stuck on trying to elaborate a complex or particularly stubborn story. Let it go, come back to it the next time. So that is pretty much the conclusion of our little chat. I have there is a concluding part. It's really my favorite, well, I won't say my favorite part. I think it's the most interesting part. So here it is. But since I often talk about storytelling as a metaphor for product management, I've included this because remember how we said that we say once upon a time when we start off a fairy tale. And then when we finish it off, we say, and they lived happily ever after. But it's kind of interesting that not everybody says happily ever after. If we were to go to South Africa and we spoke Afrikaans, we would say, flout, flout, the story is out. I just love the way it basically flout means it would be the sound of a flute. So it would be basically toot, toot, the story is done. In Bengali, we would say, Amar kothati puroro, notegachti norolo. And that means the story is over and the goat has eaten the spinach. If we were from Bulgaria, we would say itri dniyali pili vesilili, which means, and for 3 days they ate, drank, and had a good time. So definitely that's a pitch for visiting Bulgaria. And in Swedish, where I have many friends and I know a little bit of Swedish, at the end of a fairy tale, we say, snip, snap, snoot, sovargen saga snoot, which means snip, snap, snoot, the story is over. And with that, my presentation is over. Thank you all very much. Here's my contact information. I'm pretty publicly out there. LinkedIn is where I usually hang out. You're welcome to engage me in any way you want. Throw me a contact on LinkedIn. I gladly accept all and any contacts on LinkedIn. This is my personal email because you never know. And I encourage any of you that want to talk. We have plenty of time to answer and talk about and answer some questions. So I will give it back to you, Kit.
I have a question.
All right.
What's your feeling or your expertise on splitting stories that don't finish in an iteration?
Oh yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
It's something that coaches really hate to talk about. Ideally, we don't want that to happen. And I don't want to talk about myself again, but this is another subject that I find very interesting. And I've actually named a pattern after this called the Wraparound Pattern. And the wraparound anti-pattern happens when we do some planning and we create some sort of plan, and then we get to the end of our we get to the end of our time, and all of a sudden we realize we've taken on too much work, and we have to push work to the next sprint, which then disturbs the next sprint's plan, and then work gets pushed into the next sprint, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that pattern will go on endlessly. And it is a sign of lack of basically taking on too much. It's a sign of over-engagement. When I coach teams, especially new teams, I teach them that you are so much better off under-committing than over-committing. Most teams will tend, the doom dominoes, I like that, when teams overcommit, this is exactly what we see. And the job of a coach primarily is to make sure that teams overcommit. So Alan, please forgive me, but I'm kind of unasking your question by saying that we should never find ourselves, ideally never find ourselves in that situation. If our stories are small enough, we will not be in that situation. If we find ourselves in the wraparound anti-pattern, you might start to consider that maybe you need to rethink how you do your estimating and do your planning, and that maybe you need to really get with your team and talk about what is the team commitment? What are we really committed to do here? Also, we have to be content that if we get 75% of what we think done, that's an A, dude. If we get 75% done in this day and age with the pandemic and all this other nonsense going on, if you can get 75% of what you promised done in the software world, I consider that a great victory. I consider 85% to be high performing. That's what I coach teams. If you can consistently get 85 to 90% accuracy, you're a high performing team. You're a superstar team.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, my question was directly, like, the ideal scenario here is it's a small story, but it was stuck with defects. And so maybe the developer cleared the defects, but it never got a chance to do final QA. And so we have a couple of tasks remaining. Do we create a new story with just the remaining tasks, or other people say, no, you got to move the whole story over?
Regrettably, if I'm given those two choices, partial value, there's no such thing as partial value. It's like being like half pregnant. It just doesn't work that way. The value is either delivered or it's not delivered. If we have a story and it's not delivered, whatever the reason, we don't care. At the end of the sprint, we reflect on it in our retrospective time, and we try to, we need to figure out, how did we get there? Why did this happen? We can't just that's what I call the Jira dump, right? If you end the sprint and start a new one in Jira, it just throws everything in the next sprint. Okay, next sprint, boom, done, okay? We definitely don't want to do that. If we don't complete a story, we do want to figure out why, because we want to learn from what happened. It's not sufficient just to whack the thing in half and say, oh, well, we said this was a 5-point story, but after we finished the sprint, we figured out it was a 2-point story and a 3-point story. That's unhealthy. So I would say partial value is no value at all. If it can't be demoed, it's not done. And that's up to your team to decide on a case-by-case basis how to dispose with incomplete work. I don't think I'm too hardcore, but if I say incomplete work, if it can't be demoed, it can't be delivered. If it can't be demoed, can't be delivered. If it can't be demoed, it ain't done. So regrettably, we re-estimate it and we replan it into our next sprint. But yes, we do re-estimate it. That we do, but we don't change the story. We already put enough work into writing that story. We don't want to do that double work.
So are you going to re-estimate the remaining work or re-estimate in toto?
You estimate it as you understand it at that moment. So yes, it would be the remaining work, and you don't even know right? If it's incomplete, you don't know what the remaining work is. So yes, you have to re-estimate with caution. Frequently, and I've seen this before. Frequently, I've seen the 3-point story be incomplete and then all of a sudden show up as a 5-point story. I'm like, wait a minute. Like, what did you learn in like the 24 hours that between the time we had our review and the time we went to planning? And you need to get with your team and figure out why that's happening. And it's not to say that we should blame people for not finishing stories. We should figure out how not to plan stories that we can't finish and how to write stories that we know will be finished. And that's really what it's about. I hate to say it, there's no easy answer to that question. It's the question that we talk about all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks.
I'm going to share. I do have some additional resources on story writing. Regrettably, I don't have in a form that I can give to you, but I will be happy to share that with Kat, and I'll put that out on LinkedIn. That's actually a good idea. I do have some really good source materials on product management from the standpoint of storytelling. It's really, really super effective way of wrangling a product a product into submission so that it can be built.
We have another question.
Sure.
I'll just go ahead and read it out loud. So in the beginning example, if I heard correctly, you mentioned 5 points means we'll take more than 1/2 the sprint. Where is that coming from? Aren't numbers relative, and how are they getting aligned to definite time frame?
Good question, and I apologize it did intend to qualify that. This is kind of estimation as taught by Scaled Agile Framework specifically, where they kind of preach relative estimation, but they teach baseline estimation. So they teach basically that they tell you, well, how do you figure out your team's capacity? Well, you figure out the number of people in your team and you multiply by 8. And that's your capacity. And then you subtract from that. It's right out of safe. You subtract from that when people are not going to be around, and then that's your kind of default capacity. So if that's your capacity, if your capacity is in, person days or whatever you want to call it, then your estimates are going to be in the same format, at least before you've established the team baseline. I can tell you relative estimation is great, but you still end up with the same problem, which is how much work can we do in a time box? And the only way to find out is trial and error, because your team is different from the next team, is different from the next team, is different from the next team. And you have to qualify that based on how your team operates. Estimation is a whole thing in and of itself. As I said, I'm not really a super big advocate of big stories. I'm a no estimates guy. It's my belief that you can do a much better job of figuring out the capacity of a team by looking at the team's history and using statistics than you can of looking at a story and trying to figure out how big it is. And I have a couple of people no estimate. So the answer, the real answer is you should never have any piece of work that's so big that it's even controversial about how big it is. And I hear all the time, well, Mitch, there's just no way that this story can be split. I guarantee you, if you try, you can find a way to split it. There was a question I saw flash by about architecture and splitting across architecture. And that's a very interesting problem because we always say that we want to try and demo full slices of functionality. Well, does that necessarily mean that we have to demo all the way from the front end all the way to the back end? How do we get stuff like that done in 2 weeks? And the answer is we don't. We have to use simulations in order to prove out our UIs, use simulation and automated testing to prove out APIs. Those are perfectly legitimate slices of an architecture. If you can demo it, it's a legitimate slice. If I can demo it, I can demo a front end with a fake back end. I can demo a back end with a fake front end. That's good enough for me. And then we integrate later on, and we make our integration separate from our value delivery. More questions? Thanks, Ashish.
Yeah, so I think I passed by a question earlier. Any example of splitting stories with modularization? It would not be a full vertical slice, but still testable.
Right. Once you start getting into modularity, it's a different dimension, and it's. I'll talk about it because I'm sure there are a couple people that are interested in it. But modularization is another. It's kind of the horizontal view of an API, and it's very closely related to the different way that we have different ways that we test, and sometimes we organize stories by how we test them. So if you have an architecture that has an automated testing capability, is going to be easier to test than something that it has to be manually tested, for example. So that's where modularity also comes in. But I'm not going to get into, it's not an architecture talk. There's a whole lot to get into. Reach out to me and we can discuss that privately. And I can give you some resources on modularity, on splitting, architectural splitting.
Okay, another question from Nadine. How does the demo and story completion process differ when your product is data/buy related?
Great question. When we do things like data related, and this is often asked of me as like a trick question. Oh, well, how do you demo a report? Or how do you demo, data collection? And the way you demo data collection is you show it happening, right? Whenever we collect data, we need to be able to inspect that data to make sure that it's the data that we expect. So when we test that data collection, we test that BI process. We always test it with a set of known data so that we have known results that we can compare it to. That test in and of itself is demonstratable. And frequently I'll recommend that be used as a way of organizing demos. If we can't demonstrate, how do you demonstrate business analysis? Well, the way you do it is you start off and say, well, here's a set of data. This is what we expect to see when this data is analyzed. Run the process. Lo and behold, here's the data that we were expecting. And that's really the only way that you can demo it, because you don't know in advance what the actual value is going to be until it runs into production. And yes, OnPat says you can demo ETL that way, and that is absolutely true. Anything that you can show that the acceptance criteria meet the value is a demonstratable thing. It can be a UI without a back end. It can be middleware without a back end or a front end. If you have test doubles or stubs or modular stubs to make it look like it's working, that's good enough. Okay, Karen asks, we make a server, nothing demoable. How do we sync this with story complication process? And it is demoable. Every server is going to have service entry points. Every service entry point is going to have an API. That API has to be tested somehow. It could be as simple as running a curl script against the service, or there must be some way that the service is tested. Showing the test is as good as showing the function. There's actually no difference. So if you produce a server that has an API, you can actually build test beds. And any API that's out there, if you guys are JavaScript guys, for example, and I mean guy, gender neutral guy, You can go out, if you want to look at JavaScript libraries, there's tons of demos out there. Every one of those libraries has a demo that's associated with the library. Well, okay, well, how do you demo a button? Well, how you demo a button? You build a front end with a button and you show what the button does. It's the same thing with your server. Whatever your server does, you can come up with a way of showing it off when you consider how you go about getting it tested. And you demo it the same way you test it, the same exact way. How do you sync it with the story elaboration process? As you walk through the API and create it, if you're doing test first, you can use those tests to show that the server functions. Run through your unit tests. If the unit tests run and the unit tests are accurate, that's a perfectly legitimate thing. Just do it in front of your, if you have enough trust in your system of your automated tests, then you don't need to demo it. That's all about what you think you need to demo. I have a question here from Ashish. If a spike is estimated for 4 hours but not resolved during that time, is it worked further on in the next sprint? I would say if you estimate a spike for 4 hours is your time box. If it's not resolved, then you would need to reallocate time in the next sprint. Yes, you would have to do that. However, that being said, I would also like to know why the spike was estimated for 4 hours and why it couldn't be resolved in that time. We always want to leave ourselves plenty of time. 4 hours is not a lot of time. So if you're working at that level of granularity with spikes, 4 hours, I can tell you, man, all you need is to like lose your Wi-Fi connection for 90 minutes and your 4 hours is going to be eaten alive. So, but the answer, the standard answer I would give is that if a spike is incomplete, yeah, it would be considered dead time. We definitely want to account for that. And we do have to work it until it's completed in the next sprint. Who decides? The product owner and the team decide. There's no rule about what the disposition of incomplete work is. It's the team's responsibility to dispose of incomplete work. And it's also the team's responsibility, not the scrum master, not the product owner, not the manager, not anybody. It's the team's responsibility to figure out what didn't go right.
Yeah, thanks, Mitch. The reason I asked that it was 4 hours because on the chat people are saying it's usually very short time that is allocated for a spike story. So it could be up to the team.
And the way, when I coach people about making mistakes, and I basically tell them it's okay to make a mistake as long as you learn from it. And as long as your team is comfortable with that, then, and it doesn't need to be an interrogation, but if you think something should take 4 hours and it turns out to take way more than that, where do you start? How do you unravel that? Does it have to do with, is the person giving an objective analysis? And also, we don't really talk about, we say spikes, we don't estimate them. We set those time boxes. We give ourselves that time and we say, wherever the condition of the work is at that time, that's the way it is. So we try to keep spikes very small. I've seen people say, oh, here's a 30-day spike. I'm like, I don't know that 30 days is a spike. That sounds more like a job to me. So estimation of spikes, be very cautious about that. Err on the side of caution, just like we do when we allocate team time to stories based on estimates. We go with about a 75 or 80% of our capacity because we always leave ourselves contingency time just for stuff like that. Yeah, 30 days, that is literally a marathon.
Thank you.
All right. And there's a big difference between figure out why it didn't get done and find out who to blame. Because when anything gets done or doesn't get done, if it's an agile team, it's the entire team's responsibility. That's what collective ownership is about. It's about everybody's responsibility. We're not trying to finger and say, oh, it was so-and-so's fault. They're the ones who didn't understand it. That's not the goal of the exercise. The goal of the exercise is to learn something useful so that we don't make the same mistake again, and it informs us better and gives us wisdom in the future. Any other questions?
Yeah, we have one from Karen. Do you
Okay.
recommend estimation on anomalies, considering that a root cause must be conducted before implementation?
Ooh, yeah, we're getting into some really foggy places here, but by, anomalies, I guess you mean, production defects. Um, that's really a whole different thing. When we, when we, um, when we talk about anomalies, usually all bets are off and we don't worry about estimation. If it's something that endangers production, then we actually stop the production line and everybody mobs on the anomaly. But yes, the root cause of an anomaly, that's not always what we want to find. Sometimes we will create a spike for finding a root cause. That is a perfectly legitimate use of spike time. But yes, frequently, root cause of anomaly is the most difficult thing to figure out. Usually what we figure out from anomaly is symptomatic, and root cause is something that only comes when an anomaly happens over and over and over again in some sort of predictable way. So I would say no estimation anomalies. Anomaly is more of that's something we gang up on. That's a mob effort, not a plannable effort. Iffy Ejo, are you for or against story pointing spikes? If by that you mean spikes where we set aside time for a team or members of the team to estimate, I am very much in favor of that. As a matter of fact, I can't believe teams try to operate without allocating time for the team to talk about stories and story pointing. Will you recommend splitting a release readiness story that always spills into the next sprint? I recommend, when we talk about release readiness, that's a really loaded term, Eva. So I assume what you mean is integration and preparation for release. In kind of the safe view or the DevOps view, we do not really do release activities as part of a development team. That's why we split those people off. And we say we have our release cadence separate from our development cadence so that we don't get caught in the sprint tidal wave of trying to time releases with development. What we should do is have development ready, have a definition of what that ready means, have the integration tests complete, and those activities take place out of band of the actual development of work. That's what, for example, the Scaled Agile System team is intended to be for. How often and when do you revisit your team definitions of ready and done? Question from Kyle. That's an excellent question. Team definitions of ready and done, I consider those to be part of a team's working agreement. And a team's working agreement is intended on being a living document. It's definitely initially created when the team is formed. I recommend that it's the first thing that a team does is introduce itself to itself and create a working agreement by which the team will operate. I say we don't revisit that, maybe not every single time we have a retrospective, but it's not the worst thing in the world if at your retrospective, if that's the way you operate, at your retrospective, if you say, oh, by the way, while we're here talking about how things went this sprint, is there anything that we need to do to update and keep our team working agreement alive? And the definitions of ready and done are just one part of a team's working agreement. So I would say that working agreement must be a living document, and it should be revisited often. Frequently, I will recommend sometimes when teams are not paying attention, sometimes we will start off and we will have the team together and we will have a team meeting and we will revisit the working agreement to make sure everybody understands what's in it and nobody has any issues with complying with the agreement. And remember, it's an agreement, it's not a contract, and it is a living document. It's not intended to be used to punish people or to bully people. It's intended to support the collective ownership of the work and assign certain important roles to certain people for making certain determinations for the benefit of the team, such as the product owner determining that a story meets the definition of done. My other recommendation is that the more complex your team definition of ready is, and the more complex your team definition of done is, the slower your team will operate. And I know that that sounds really cruel, but that is a hard fact of life. The more things you have to do in order to get work to done, every story is going to take that much longer. What are 1 or 2 things you do with your teams to try and make things fun and light, especially with everything going on today? Well, I'll tell you, it's a great question from Kyle. And as I'm trained as an Agile coach and also as a personal coach. So I can tell you this has been the weirdest year of my life. And I almost don't have an answer. Right now, the only thing we can do is try to stay connected, just like this, as much as we can. Right now, this is all we have. So I say to teams, what I've been doing lately, you're going to love this, but there's, and I think I can never remember if it's scrum.org or Scrum Alliance. They actually have a whole program on teaching people how to do Agile teamwork in Minecraft. Okay. Now, so this is what it means. What it means is that you can work on being Agile with your team and teach your team how to be Agile and work together as a team and work on pairing and mobbing exercises inside the Minecraft universe. Actually create a world and have everybody log into a server from wherever they happen to be and all be in Minecraft together. There's a chat capability and there's a great program. I'm not going to go into it right now, but if that's something that really interests me, any of these things that are online-ish, tools out there that we use now are tools like Miro, Mural, other kind of whiteboardy, mind mappy tools where people can get the feeling of being together in a team. And I know that's a little bit of a diversion, but I'm going to mention it anyway, because I mentioned my love of Swedish culture. And there's actually a word, an untranslatable word in Swedish, Ika. And if you've ever been to an IKEA or IKEA, depending on where you're from, you'll notice that that's always on the wall of the coffee shop. And fika basically translates loosely to the feeling that you get when you're having a cup of coffee with your friends in a relaxed atmosphere. And we don't have that atmosphere anymore. So we have to make do with whatever the Zoom version of fika is. Another question from Kyle. What are some initial steps you take to transition high-performing teams to no estimates? That's kind of out of scope, Kyle. I'd be glad to discuss that with you outside of this talk. That's a great question. If maybe Expert Agile Club will have me back someday, and we'll talk about. We'll really get people's dander up with some no estimates are. But I will say the very first thing that you have to do to get to no estimates is you have to be able to make your story small. So I would say. Bug me for a copy of this, which I will. I have a PDF version of the slides, which I'd be happy to give to anyone who reaches out. Get those stories small. That's the first step towards high-performing team and no estimates, is to get your work down to the size where it doesn't need to be estimated. A question from Lucy. Do bugs necessarily need to be estimated? If not, what's the best approach to handling? You mean big stories or bug stories? I'm going to assume that it means bugs, and bugs meaning defects. And I try to coach that we don't treat defects any differently than any other story, that the thing that we call a bug is basically a story about something that's not working right. And the criteria of the story are make it work right, make it work how it's supposed to. So yes, bugs need to be estimated. They need to be prioritized. They need to be elaborated. They need to be assigned. They need to be planned into your sprints. Any other questions while we're still here? We've got a couple minutes. Free consulting.
I saw a question from Charles earlier. I'm not sure if you were able to brush it.
I'm go ahead.
Do you have any suggestions for additional resources on story writing?
Yeah, and I did mention that I do have them. I don't have them handy, But I promise you, I will put out a link. I will put out a LinkedIn post that will have resources that you can use that equate storytelling and product management. And it's very interesting. I have some really good resources. There
Okay.
said that question.
Yeah, we
Lindsay?
have a question from Cho. Is it important to let team members whose capacity is reduced to estimate stories?
I'm not really sure what's being asked here. We try if team members are. What do we mean by capacity reduced? Does that mean that they've taken a holiday? I mean, I'm not sure what the question is. If you could explain.
I'm gonna go and ask.
Yeah, I'm not really sure what the ask is here.
Okay, I'm here. Now, when we're estimating a team's capacity, I mean, like, to pretty much understand if everybody's going to be there during the sprint, or are they going to guys picking up holidays or something like that. So are they allowed to, while not being there, while on holiday, while, are they allowed to estimate stories? Because they're not going to be working on it. So I was thinking, is that really so?
All right, I understand. My answer is going to be the people who estimate stories are whoever is the most appropriate person, and it's going to differ from story to story. So if you are a subject matter expert on the thing that is being discussed as a story, then by all means you should be part of that conversation. It doesn't matter if you're on the team, off the team. Sometimes you may be working for a vendor, you may be a consultant, you may be working for another company. Whoever is the most appropriate person to work on the story is the person there. The most appropriate people to estimate the story. If you don't understand the story, and you don't understand the work, and you don't understand the customer, and you don't understand the value, then you're adding no value whatsoever with your estimation. So it's always going to be people who are engaged with the story. What do I think about use cases or scenarios in stories? Generally speaking, use cases and scenarios come into play more in the QA world. Use cases are really yet another way of splitting stories that I did not kind of open that Pandora's box. But frequently we can split stories by use cases. So use cases kind of end up being stories sometimes. More frequently, use cases will be used to drive out test cases to ensure that stories are complete. Excluding story points, another question from Kyle. What are your favorite metrics to measure team progress and success? The most important metric in a team is morale. There is no metric more important than a team's morale. If your team is happy, then you're doing your thing. If your team is not happy, it will be reflected in the quality of your work. And yeah, I guess morale is not a metric, so I'll give you a better one. But I will say, number of stories completed for small stories is a good metric. This way you can get a sense of how many stories your team can act on. Your estimation gets better over time, but still the best overall measure of whether a team is effective is the morale of the team. It's very rare that you have a team that's doing well and has poor morale. And I have found that happy people do way better work than unhappy people. And yes, Retrim, one of my favorite tools, has a happiness radar. When we have retrospectives with our teams, that's one of the things that we need to talk about. You know, frequently we get bogged down in the details of, you know, like the story details or the implementation details. But, you know, the happiness of the team, that's the most important retrospective item that there is. Keeping the team happy is the most important thing. And yeah, there are a number of different ways to do that. I see Retrim as a happiness radar, also Team Health Check, Agility Health Radar is another one. There's a lot of ways of doing it. And I find that that's a much better way of figuring out whether a team is doing well